But, Mr. President, I call attention to the urgent refugee crisis that's happening in our midst, in which men, women, and children are fleeing by the thousands from the violence and destruction that has engulfed the Middle East and North Africa. This crisis didn't come out of nowhere, like an earthquake or a tornado. Instead, it's the predictable result of this administration's policies of leading from behind. As conflicts metastasized in the vacuum created through years of inaction by President Obama and a total lack of American leadership, this did not happen by accident. It happened because of leading from behind. It happened because this president has refused to lead. And when a vacuum is created, this is the predictable result which many of us predicted. As we know, the vast majority of these refugees are from Syria, a country which has known little but death and destruction for 4 years, as a murderous dictatorship and a homicidal cult have fought a war against a common enemy, the Syrian people. As Assad and ISIL fight to rule, cruelty and atrocity reign. According to the United Nations Refugee Agency, about 63% of European asylum seekers in the past 2 years are Syrians. But the truth is, the refugee crisis is much bigger than what we are seeing today in Europe. Since 2011, well over 200,000 Syrians have been killed, 1 million injured, 8 million displaced, 4 million forced to seek refuge abroad in countries such as Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, and Egypt, where the situation is not much better. The United Nations has described this crisis as, quote, the greatest humanitarian tragedy of our times. As conditions at refugee camps in the region continue to deteriorate, with overcrowding, disease, violence, and exploitation, those who can are attempting to escape further west to safer places in Europe. The United Nations estimates that at least 850,000 people will seek refuge in Europe between 2015 and 2016. About a quarter of these will be children. These children are increasingly leaving their families and homes to make dangerous journeys by sea and land. While they're risking their lives to escape the threat of abduction, sexual abuse, torture, and murder, they face an entirely new set of threats on this desperate journey for asylum. Many are traversing unsafe routes, suffering from starvation, facing the threat of human trafficking, and enduring debilitating psychological trauma, and, of course, many are dying. The UN Refugee Agency has stated that about 2,600 people have died while attempting to cross the Mediterranean this year alone, including 3-year-old Aylan Kurdi. Aylan grew up in the Syrian city of Kobani, a city situated on the border of Turkey that in recent years has been under siege by ISIL militants and the Assad regime. Facing increasing turmoil and unrest, Aylan's father Abdullah and mother Rain did what any parent would do for their children. They attempted to move Aylan and his 5-year-old brother Galip to a safer home. Abdullah arranged his family to board a boat bound for Sweden by way of Greece, a trip that many of his fellow Syrians have attempted over the years. But when the Kurdi family met their smugglers in Turkey, they were surprised how crowded the small, flimsy fiberglass boat was. Despite repeated questions about the safety of the voyage, the smugglers assured Abdullah they would be okay. Shortly into the trip, the waters became increasingly rough, crashing into the boat, rocking it back and forth until it capsized, launching the passengers, including Aylan, his mother and 4-year-old brother, into the rough waters. Despite Abdullah's strongest attempts, he was unable to save his family. This photo, which was taken shortly after Aylan's dead body was washed ashore, has opened the world's eyes to this devastating crisis. Within hours of this photo being posted, people across the world began to share it on social media, using a hashtag in Arabic that translates to humanity washed ashore. This image has haunted the world. But what should haunt us even more than the horror unfolding before our eyes, the thought that the United States will continue to do nothing meaningful about it. The conflicts in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen, and elsewhere in the Middle East and North Africa have taken the lives of Aylan and countless other desperate refugees, are not only a threat to our security, but a crisis of conscience, a crisis of conscience. They challenge the moral fabric of our nation and the foundation of global leadership. Let's be clear. The current crisis before us is not a migrant issue. It's not migrants. Migrants leave for economic reasons. It's not. It is a mass exodus of refugees who are fleeing conflicts that this administration has refused to address for years. As the UN High Commissioner stated last week, this is a primarily refugee crisis, not only a migration phenomena. The vast majority of those arriving in Greece come from conflict zones like Syria, Iraq, or Afghanistan, and are simply running for their lives. So I say to the media, stop calling it a migrant. These are not migrants. These are refugees from torture, from murder, from killing, from genocide. Statements like and images like these should not be just a source of outbreak and sympathy. They should be a call to action. Let me just read a quote from the Wall Street Journal editorial this morning. Quote, "Another Syria failure. It's hard to believe, but the debacle that is the Obama administration's Syria policy could get worse. U.S. sources have been leaking that Russia may be preparing for a major military deployment to keep Bashar Assad in power in Damascus. By some reports quoting Western diplomats, a Russian expeditionary force is already in Syria preparing for the arrival of jets and attack helicopters to carry out strikes against Islamic State. Mr. Assad is a Russian ally, and Vladimir Putin isn't about to let the Syrian government fall without a bigger fight. Like so much else in the Middle East, President Obama has created an opening for this Russian intervention by minimizing U.S. interests in the outcome of Syria's civil war. He has refused to offer more than token help to pro-Western Syrians, thus ceding the battleground to radical Islamists or the Assad, Russia, Iran, Hezbollah axis. Don't expect a decline in the flow of refugees anytime soon." Just a few months after the revolution in Syria began in 2011, President Obama issued his presidential study directive stating, quote, "Preventing mass atrocities and genocide is a core national security interest and a core moral responsibility of the United States." That was in 2011. He went on to say, "Our security is affected when masses of civilians are slaughtered, refugees flow across borders, and murderers wreak havoc on regional stability and livelihoods." In 2013, President Obama, speaking at the U.S. Holocaust Museum, the president said, and I quote, "Too often, the world has failed to prevent the killing of innocents on a massive scale, and we are haunted by the atrocities that we did not stop and the lives we did not save." And in a 2013 address to the UN General Assembly, President Obama said this, and I'd like to quote him at length. Quote, this is the President's address to the United Nations General Assembly. Quote, "The principle of sovereignty is at the center of our international order, but sovereignty cannot be a shield for tyrants to commit wanton murder or an excuse for the international community to turn a blind eye. While we need to be modest in our belief that we can remedy every evil, while we need to be mindful that the world is full of unintended consequences, should we really accept the notion that the world is powerless in the face of a Rwanda or Srebrenica? If that's the world that people want to live in, they should say so and reckon with the cold logic of mass graves. I suggest strongly that given the fact that there is no policy, as there's no strategy, there is no effective way of stemming this horror, that the President of the United States should say so and reckon with the cold logic of mass graves. That was our president. I agree, by the way, with every word he said. But how can the American people reconcile these words with pictures of dead children and desperate refugees literally running for their lives? How can President Obama say it is our moral obligation to do what we can to prevent the worst atrocities in our world, but refuses to do anything to stop the atrocities that are occurring every single day in Syria and across the Middle East? Where is that President Obama today? Where is the President Obama who has spoken so movingly of the moral responsibilities that great power confers? Unfortunately, the administration is still, quote, considering a range of options, unquote. I'm not making that up. Still, quote, considering a range of options to respond to this issue. And a National Security Council spokesman stated this week, in the meantime, the President and his cabinet officials continue to push through an agreement that legitimizes Iran, which is not only the leading state sponsor of terror in the world, but the patron of the Assad regime responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of innocent Syrians. After this deal, Iran's power in the region will only be enhanced, and it is safe to assume that it will use the billions of dollars in sanctions relief to boost arms supplies to Iran's terrorist proxies, to sow chaos and instability across the region, and prop up Assad right when he needs it most. As the administration stands by, Russia is capitalizing on America's inaction to provide additional support for the Assad regime. According to numerous press reports, Russia is establishing a base at an airfield near an Assad stronghold in western Syria. Russia could soon deploy 1,000 or more military personnel into Syria to conduct air operations in support of Assad's forces. Our government is doing what it has sadly done too often in the past. We're ceding our strength and averting our eyes. We try to comfort our guilty consciences by telling ourselves that we're not doing nothing, but it is a claim made in bad faith. For everyone concedes that nothing we are doing is equal to the horrors we face. We are telling ourselves we're too tired or weary to get more involved, that this is not our problem, that helping to resolve this crisis is not our responsibility, and that there are no options to end the conflicts around the world today. The truth is, there's plenty that could have been done to avoid the devastation unfolding before our eyes. In 2011, in 2012, in 2013, in 2014. And there's still more that we can do today to respond to this growing crisis. My friends, my colleagues, my fellow Americans, I fear the longer this violence goes on, the more difficult it will be to bring it to an end. Failing to do so will leave a dangerous vacuum that enables extremism and instability to grow and provides terrorists the space, resources, and recruits that they need to wreak havoc on the region and threaten the United States of America. It's not too late. We must not avert our eyes from Aylan and the millions of other refugees running for their lives. We must commit to a strategy to defeat the malign forces in the region that are sowing chaos and mass destruction. Failing to act now leaves us with even fewer options to rectify this terrible chapter in our history. And speaking of history, Mr. President, I am a student of history, and I don't believe there are exact parallels in American history. But there are certain areas where a failure to lead leads to catastrophic consequences. In 1938, on October 5th, a man named Winston Churchill, who had been shunned by his colleagues, had been ridiculed in the House of Commons for his constant speaking and warning. And one of my favorites of the appearances that he made before the House of Commons and his fellow citizens, he said, And do not suppose this is the end. This is only the beginning of the reckoning. This is only the first sip, the first foretaste of a bitter cup, which will be proffered to us year by year, unless by a supreme recovery of moral health and martial vigor, we rise again and take our stand for freedom, as in olden time. Mr. President, I yield the floor.